Travel ban back down, the government is planning to repatriate Australians stranded in India following public outcry. Welcome to Q&A.
Hi there and welcome to the program. Joining me on the panel tonight, Shadow Minister for Families and Social Services, Linda Burney. Hi. Former lawyer, author and advocate, Bree Lee. Finance journalist, Alan Kohler, who works across the ABC, The New Daily and The Eureka Report. Psychologist turned politician, Liberal member for Reid, Fiona Martin. And journalist and author of See What You Made Me Do, which is now a documentary series, Jess Hill. Please make all of them feel welcome. Now, a little later on this evening, we'll bring you a live performance from the incredible Julia Stone. I promise that is worth sticking around for. You can stream us live on iView and all the socials. As always, Quanda is the hashtag. Please do keep it respectful. Our first question tonight comes from Manikor Warmer.
First, you grant us exemptions to go to India to look after our loved ones who are fighting for their lives. Then you abandon us, leave us to die in a country that's gasping for air. What kind of government does that to their own people? In 2019, the Prime Minister said that Australia is like a fragrant garam masala. In 2020, the Prime Minister said that on a Saturday that when I'm free, I like to make it a family curry night. For the Prime Minister, is the value of Indians reduced to just our food, or does he see us as equals?
Before we go to the panel, how did this decision, this travel ban and the threat of criminal penalties make you feel?
It's horrific. I've got family, extended family and friends in India, and each day we hear stories that, we can't even talk about those stories. What's going on in India is horrible, and to know that we're not treated the same as everyone else, it's just appalling.
Fiona Martin.
Yeah, hi. Look, obviously it's a devastating situation in India at the moment with over 300,000 cases per day. And, many people are finding this period incredibly difficult, not having seen loved ones for so long, particularly in my electorate of Reid. The travel ban that's been put in place has been based on health advice, expert health advice. Last month we saw over 40% of people that were travelling home from India testing positive to COVID-19 in comparison to other countries, for example, people coming from the United States that were only testing about 6%. So this is based on travel advice. And this ban, obviously the government wants to resume repatriation flights as soon as possible. In the last 12 months, the Australian government has facilitated 38 flights from India to Australia for Australians, and that was approximately 5,000 Australians returning home from India.
Fiona Martin, almost 5% of your electorate is made up of people of Indian origin. Are they telling you that they believe this has made them feel lesser citizens, that this is perhaps racially motivated?
No, I think people understand the high incidence of COVID-19 in India at the moment, which is devastating for the country. The decision by the Australian government is based on health advice so that we don't increase the risk or have an outbreak here in Australia.
But you haven't heard that from any of your constituents, the sorts of sentiments we're hearing tonight?
The penalty is what has been of concern by constituents, not the ban itself. And as I mentioned earlier in the week, that I thought that the travel, the penalty was a little heavy-handed, and that that part of it was problematic. However, the Prime Minister has said that it is very unlikely that that will be put into effect. So what we're focusing on right now is increasing the capacity of the Howard Springs facility from 850 people to 2,000 people so that we can accommodate more people here in Australia and resume repatriation flights as soon as possible from India.
Linda Burney, based on medical advice, and the government is now planning to get them home.
I think this issue raises more questions, and I respect Fiona's answer, but it just seems to me a number of things. First of all, the government has clearly not handled quarantine well, and certainly repatriation very poorly. So that's the first point. The second point is this, is that we're not talking about people who are not Australian citizens. I mean, that's the point. They are Australian citizens, and Australian governments are responsible for keeping their citizens safe and providing them with as much support as possible in difficult circumstances. And the other thing to remember is that for someone from India to take out citizenship in Australia, Indian citizenship has to be renounced. Now, that's not the case everywhere, and that's a big thing. And finally, Hamish, why announce fines up to, what is it, $66,000 and 5 years jail, and then 2 days later both the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister says, oh, well, they'll never be used. Why announce them in the first place? And I think... and I think, and I have a very multicultural electorate as well, is that there are a number of Indian people who are Australians with Indian heritage, who are feeling absolutely abandoned, and the repatriation flights that are being resumed, I hope, are not a political response to a human issue.
Alan Kohler.
Can I just intervene? This is not a political response. This is a health response. This decision has been based on health advice.
Well, I'm pretty sick of the health officials being lumbered with this is what the health officials have advised. This is a political decision. Let us be clear.
I wonder whether the Prime Minister watched the premiers last year take health advice and make really tough decisions throughout last year to announce lockdowns, and as a result of that became more popular. All of the premiers were tremendously popular because of that, and I reckon the Prime Minister probably thought that if he took health advice and made a very harsh decision on this, he'd be more popular. But the miscalculation was that Australians, I think, are very happy to make sacrifices themselves for the greater good, but they're not happy asking other people who are less fortunate than themselves to make sacrifices for them.
Jess Hill, you've worked for a time as a foreign correspondent. There is, I suppose, a pact, an expectation for Australians overseas that in dire straits, the government would help you get home. I don't think many would imagine that you'd be stopped from coming home. Do you think that this was political?
I think that the point of our border policies since the Tampa has been cruelty as a deterrent. I think that it's an easy place for the government to return to. It's familiar. I think it's interesting what Fiona said earlier, that 40% of people returning from India had COVID. Now, that can tell you all sorts of different things. It can tell you, wow, these people are a real threat to our country because they're bringing back COVID into the country. Or it can also tell you, wow, our Australians in India are in a lot of danger, given that 40% of them are returning with COVID, given that we know that in Delhi alone, there's only half the amount of oxygen that hospitals need to treat patients, and that that bodies are being burned in parks, in public parks, because there's not enough room for the number of people who are dying. So when we think about health advice, sure, that's health advice based on the fact that we haven't had effective quarantining. But what about the health advice for those 9,000 Australians who have such a high likelihood of contracting COVID and being left in a system that has utterly collapsed?
Can I just add to that although the government have now announced the repatriation flights, it's really important that we all pay attention to what the court rules in relation to these legal challenges that people have raised, because COVID isn't going anywhere. And what we are seeing over the last 12 plus months is an increase in the use of what is essentially a type of emergency power. And if history tells us anything, it's that once governments enjoy and have and start growing their use of emergency powers, they don't like giving them up. And so it will be very interesting to see what the court rules.
Because there is no Bill of Rights in Australia. It's unclear what our rights actually are on this, right?
So one of the legal challenges is that there is an implied right to return, because what is citizenship if not an implied right to reside?
Fiona Martin, the government, as you pointed out, has relied on the health advice. But Jess Hill was making the point about the dire situation that Australians in India find themselves in. And actually the health advice from the Chief Medical Officer also warned of the potential consequences of this move, including the risk of serious illness and, in a worst case scenario, deaths. So why didn't the government lean on that bit of the health advice?
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you properly here, but I did get part of the question. Look, part of the decision was based on health advice for the ban, and I think that it's important that we take the health advice. Australia has been successful in suppressing COVID-19.
I understand. I don't think you heard the question though, because part of the health advice was also that these people in India faced the risk of serious illness and, in a worst case scenario, deaths. So I don't understand why the government lent on one part of the health advice, yet seemed to ignore that part of it.
It's for a headline, that's why.
All right. I think we're going to just try and reconnect our audio link to Fiona Martin there in Sydney, and we'll come back to that when we can. Let's move to our next topic. It's a question that comes from Sue in our studio audience.
Thank you.
So there's Sue.
I endured 25 years of verbal, emotional, and in the end, physical abuse. And what I now know is coercive control and gaslighting. I fled to save my life, and I often now think if it's a life worth living. I will always be on medication. I doubt that I'll ever repartner, and I don't have my own family anymore. It's more than a mother can bear sometimes, I can tell you. I hear Jess Hill saying that this is solvable. What will criminalisation of coercive control, how will it fix this?
Jess Hill.
Thanks so much for your question, Sue, and I'm just so sorry for what you were subjected to and what you still have to live with. I think when I talk about criminalising coercive control and when others talk about it, we're actually not talking about fixing the entire system. What we're talking about is fixing what I believe to be a broken part of our criminal justice system. It's something that was set up in the 1980s when we first thought about how can we get police involved in what is, crimes happening in households all across the nation. And obviously people thought, well, we need proof. You need to have a physical incident so that you can gather evidence. And what we've since understood is that actually that only gets to certain parts of a puzzle, and they're disparate. And for some people, physical violence isn't present at all. And for those people, the access to the criminal justice system is basically denied. And so what we're proposing with criminalising coercive control is to make the entire arc of what you were subjected to visible. Not just the physical incidents, not just the things that our criminal justice system recognises now, but everything from the start to the finish, so that we understand what the risks are, what the damage has been, and how dangerous the offender is. And I think that once we understand coercive control from a criminal justice system perspective, it has a flow-on effect to how coercive control is understood from a health perspective in the family law system, and also how it's reported, because the way that crime and domestic violence crime is reported in the media is based on assault. So general public understands domestic violence primarily through the lens of assault and not as it actually is, which is, in the majority of cases that are serious, coercive control.
Bree Lee.
Yeah, look, I really commend Jess for the work that she's done in putting even just the terminology of coercive control into the mainstream in Australia. That's huge. What I am concerned about, and I certainly don't think we're disagreeing with each other in any sense, is that it is, for many reasons, it seems to be easier in Australia to reform legislation than it is to reform policing. And my concern is that one of the potential wonderful effects of criminalising coercive control is that it broadens the type of evidence, for example, that can be brought. And my expertise is with sex crime rather than domestic and family abuse, but this is where they overlap, where we hear from a lot of survivors that they don't feel like they have the opportunity to actually tell their story and give any context because, as Jess was saying, the law is only set up to deal with these specific instances. What I'm concerned about is that at the moment, for example, it takes easily 3, 4, 5 years for an allegation of any kind of sex crime matter to make it from preliminary complaint through to trial. If we're broadening the types of matters that can be considered criminal, that would need to happen with such an incredibly huge extra commitment of resourcing and not just training, but retraining, learning for police and unlearning. Otherwise, what I'm seeing is a potential for more people to enter a system that is not built for them the way it is now.
Linda Burney.
Hi, Sue, and thanks for your bravery. And I stand with you and certainly know the shoes that you've stood in a very personal way myself. The issue of coercive control is something, and I agree with everything that everyone said, but it's something that I want people to know about. It's something that I want young people to understand. And it's something that I want people to understand is often the basis to destroying a person. You know, you can get your bones broken, you can get spat on, you can get choked, you can experience all those things. But coercive control destroys you from inside. It takes away who you are. And to rebuild that is a very difficult thing to do. I, like Jess, agree that coercive control should be criminalised. I know there are arguments around it. I know that it's difficult because of the way in which domestic violence is viewed. But it is such a prevalent thing in most DV relationships. It has to be dealt with either through a legal response, but certainly governments have a responsibility. And what I'm on about, Hamish, is having a national definition of domestic violence that includes coercive control, so we're all operating from the same space.
So I just want to introduce into this conversation someone that has some experience both individually but also as an advocate. Nicole Lee is in the audience tonight. What's your view on the focus on introducing legislation around coercive control?
Well, a lot of the arguments have been built on these very bold statements around that, you know, criminalisation will save lives, and the criminalisation will be a deterrent for people perpetrating violence. And the thing that actually is sitting with a lot of the advocates is sitting with the researchers, and the researchers in Australia with 40 years of research behind them, and what we have seen along the way is that, you know, there is no proof right now that says that criminalising coercive control will save lives. There is no proof to back that. It is very misleading. We have to be very certain around what is the expectation around this criminalisation. And then, you know, all the evidence that we have over the 40 years of criminalising domestic violence offences, that, you know, domestic violence offences have not decreased like they have with other violent offences. You know, the rates of domestic violence has not decreased with criminalising it. And, you know, and at this point in time in Australia, our researchers are saying that this, you know, the system is not quite ready for this. We have people, and I'm one of those people, that runs from police because we do not trust them. They have been harnessed and used against us. We need to rebuild that trust with police. We need to do that training. We need to deeply embed, shifting of community attitudes, because they will be the jury of our peers, passing judgment in a trial. And all of those things, for most of us, is that we want to see those things done first. And within Victoria, it's one of the very first questions that Victoria Police are asking, is the person controlling where you go, your money? Are they monitoring you? Are they stalking you? This is already starting to be done in Victoria, and they need to start doing those things in other states. Embed the change, prove it, rebuild the trust so that people will go to help-seeking behaviour. And the other piece to this is that, a lot of the evidence and research, one of them is the Loddon Campsie research, was that victim survivors, across the board, well, not really across the board, but the main consensus is, and again, I was one of them that said, I want the violence to stop, and I want this person to get help, and I don't want to make a statement right now because I want to give him every possible chance to engage and do those things. And at the point where I did lay charges was when he was completely and utterly refusing that help.
Just want to get a response from Jess Hill to some of the things you said, but particularly this question about whether there is any evidence at all to suggest that criminalising coercive control would create change.
Okay, and thank you so much, Nicole. I think you're an amazing advocate, and you've always spoken so clearly on this. Let me just tell you what experience we've seen, say, for example, in Scotland. When they criminalised coercive control a couple of years ago, police were enthused about it because it gave them the mandate to investigate the entire circumstance of the relationship. What the specialist DV prosecutor for Scotland has found is that now that they're looking at that entire relationship and not just the incidents, they have a whole heap more evidence that is admissible to court to prove what has happened, and more importantly, to prove who is the primary perpetrator in the situation. They can admit text messages, bank records, photos, testimony from friends and family as to whether that person was isolated. And it has been so effective, this evidence collection, that the vast majority of defendants are pleading guilty. So victims are not even having to go through trial. That is vastly different to the situation that existed before. And what they've also found, and I think we're going to see this replicated in other jurisdictions, is that prior to this law being introduced, 12 to 15% of perpetrators that were convicted were women. That was obviously more than what academics say. It should be about 4 or 5%. After the coercive control laws were introduced, the number of total perpetrators that were women went down to 4%. Okay, so what we're seeing is that an incident-based model that looks only at what happened in the past hour, as far as court is concerned, is going to misidentify victims as perpetrators by default.
Just before we move on, I want to pick up on something really valuable that Linda said, which is the value of understanding and having the language for what coercive control is, potentially separate from the law or from a criminal law response.
Yeah.
I get invited to go to schools and give talks about consent sometimes, and I'm very interested in the work that Our Watch does, and the potential transformative value for young people as part of their relationships and sexuality education to have an understanding, obviously age appropriate, all that, but to reform the community's understanding of what domestic and family abuse actually looks like, to have that happen through the next generation, and then to have that inform the way these issues are reported on, that is potentially transformative.
Alan Kohler, is that something that can be done without a big debate about legislation, do you think?
Well, I think it's worth noting that we already have stalking legislation, so that it's clear that the law can already deal with an offence that takes place over a long period of time. It doesn't have to be an event. So that's already in existence. And the other thing it seems to me about coercive control is that it's clearly a preparatory offence, in the sense that, as I understand it, 95% of domestic homicides are preceded by coercive control behaviour. And so another analogy that's already in the law, it seems to me, is preparatory terrorism offences, where people are getting picked up for doing things that aren't a terrorist act, but they're doing things that are preparatory to doing that. So for those reasons, I think not only can the law do it, but it should criminalise coercive control. For sure.
I want to introduce Superintendent Greg Moore, who's here from New South Wales Police. You work on the south coast of New South Wales. The point that was being made by Nicole Lee was that actually, what's the point of legislation unless you get cultural change, particularly around the way policing is conducted in these environments, and you specialise in domestic violence. How is it changing? What are you doing to handle this differently?
Look, I think it's a great point. You know, there's no quick fixes to this scourge of this terrible crime of domestic violence, and I certainly acknowledge Sue and the other survivors in the room tonight. Look, obviously coercive control and controlling behaviours is a big issue in abusive relationships, and that's certainly something that we are looking at. You know, for example, in New South Wales, changing the legislation to extend the admissibility of controlling behaviours. So I think that's a good thing. I share your concerns, Sue, about, you know, at the end of the day, we don't want to make things harder for victims. We want to keep the victims protected, and we don't want to have any unintended consequences for legislation. So we need to tread carefully and take into account potential unintended consequences. But on your point on the culture, yes, I think you know, we've seen a great progression in police culture and the way we respond to domestic violence, certainly in the 34 years that I've been in the police.
But how has it changed? Just describe actually what is different today compared to the 1980s when you started.
Yeah, sure. Look, you know, this crime is a crime that impacts all sections of the community and society, and we have to bring society into the conversation if we want to address it. So certainly some of the success that you've been out and visited the areas in Western New South Wales, for example, Hamish, and we're now scaling up down on the south coast of New South Wales. We're sitting at the table, we're talking to victims, the community, some of the areas that there's higher per capita domestic violence being reported, and we're working through local solutions to the problems, developing a rapport with the community, the victims, the service providers, so we can close that loop and support the victims, but more importantly, prevent the violence in the first place.
Nicole,
can I give a bit of context? Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, can I give a bit of context to what Greg's saying? Just because he's probably one of the standout senior police in the state. I've just visited Bourke and Nowra. Bourke used to be where Greg Moore was stationed as superintendent. He's now on the south coast of New South Wales. And I was visiting the Justice Reinvestment Project out in Bourke, where Greg worked with the community to establish Operation Solidarity, where it was really about taking that first call out as an intervention point, not to just go out and blindly charge a person with an offence, although if that was necessary, that would be done, but to go out, whether it be with an elder from the community, someone, you know, from mental health, just to go out and visit that family, talk to that perpetrator, make sure that they knew that their abuse was now visible, but also offer them help and assistance. And when I was down in Nowra speaking to the amazing Aboriginal-led community group Waminda, you know, they were talking about what it's been like since Greg came to their area, and the fact that they meet with Greg 3 times a week to case manage what's happened in the last couple of days. And, you know, sorry to verbal you, Greg, I hope I'm not, but, you know, the things that they were saying to me was that Greg will say, if you have a bad experience with a cop, come and tell me. You know, there's immediate accountability there, and that's what we need in our police forces around the country, because that is not happening everywhere.
I think it's really important, and thanks, Greg, and Nowra's a great place. And I know Waminda very well. I think it's really important, Hamish, in this discussion, that we understand, and I'm sure Sue would agree with me, that not everyone's going to go to the police. There is so much DV and sexual violence crime that is never going to be reported. Half of the people that present to emergency wards with domestic violence injuries are children. In this debate, we don't often hear the voices of women from a coal background. We don't often hear the voices of Aboriginal people. We often don't hear the voices of young people gay and trans people. And the way in which various groups respond to violence is particular. But I think it's really important to understand that a criminal response is never going to be the option for a lot of people.
Fiona Martin, I'm not sure if your audio is now working, but I'm interested to hear whether you support criminalising coercive control. Would you like to see legislation?
I've heard bits and pieces, and I know that you're talking about coercive control. I am very supportive of legislating coercive control. I think that we need to go far beyond that as well. I think that our country has a crisis on our hands with domestic violence. It is a national emergency, and we need to do more. We need to do better to address the scourge of domestic violence in our country. One way that we can do that is by targeting young people through education. There has been growing research that suggests that children who are recipients of corporal punishment in childhood go on to either be victims of domestic and family violence or perpetrators of domestic and family violence. So we know that if we can not only legislate coercive control but also legislate to ensure that children are not recipients of corporal punishment, that will go a long way to preventing domestic violence in Australia. But that's not it. We need to educate
what you mean by that?
Young people.
You want laws banning, further laws banning any kind of physical interaction between parents and children? Is that what you're talking about?
I can't hear you, Hamish. I'm so sorry.
This isn't working brilliantly, but Greg Moore, just out of interest, would legislation around coercive control be helpful to you? Do you think it would make a difference at street level?
Oh, certainly, for example, with grounds for apprehended violence orders, for example, if we could extend the admissibility of evidence around controlling behaviours, I think that would be a good start, and certainly to look at extending the admissibility of controlling behaviours. We already can take into account things such as stalking and intimidation, but we know that the behaviours can go far beyond that.
Nicole Lee, I just want to bring you back in. I mean, you're hearing from a police officer who deals with this. Actually, it might make things easier to pursue.
When we position this within the civil justice system, where domestic violence orders are being applied for, then yes, I absolutely agree. Being able to apply for an order on non-physical forms of violence is one of the things that does need to be strengthened, and again is something that is we're trying to work on in Victoria. But I wanted to sort of respond to Jess and her talking about overseas, and the evidence and the data that was received last month is that in 2018-2019 that it has actually dropped in its effectiveness, and it is not actually being the panacea that they were actually expecting it to be. Or
Are you talking about Scotland here?
Yes, overseas, and so whilst it started off fairly strong, and you would think that these things would be getting better and building as the training is embedding, that is actually stepping backwards, and that's a little bit alarming. And we should really be looking at that data, analysing it, how that fits in Australia and how that fits in a colonised country that is, criminalising our Indigenous community at far greater rates than anybody else in the community, and people with complex mental health, and people like myself that had the law used as punishment and misidentified as the aggressor. We still have big problems with that in this country, and it's not that people don't believe that this needs to be a law. We want to see that deep embedded change before we bring in a law. And the other thing is, going into that courtroom, I've been in there, I came out the other side just as broke, just as damaged, and if not more damaged than when I went in. I was spoken of by a man who had pled guilty as being, problemed, riddled with problems, mental health. The crazy woman trope is alive and well in every single courtroom, and until we fix that, we're going to funnel more women into this system, more victims into this system, to come out the other side just more broken than before. This will not fund recovery services for our children and young people. This will not heal my sons. This will not heal the trauma that I still carry within me, which drives the position I've got right now. These are the things that I want to see sort of done before we just look at this one piece of the puzzle over here in a courtroom. You know, those courtrooms are not trauma-informed and they are causing damage. We've got a bunch of leaky buckets and we're saying, let's bring in another leaky bucket into this system rather than actually repairing some of these leaks that victims are falling through.
OK, well, if this conversation raises any issues for you, you can contact 1800-RESPECT or Lifeline on the numbers on your screen right now. Now, the federal budget is about to be handed down next week, so on that topic, our next question is from Jenna Patterson.
Hi. My husband and I have 10-week-old twins. I was the main income earner, so we decided that I would go back to work and he would stay at home as the stay-at-home dad, the primary caregiver. According to the Paid Parental Leave Scheme, my husband isn't recognised as a primary caregiver and can't claim it. It relies on the birth mother claiming it, and then the father can have the payments transferred to him, recognising him as the primary caregiver only if it's transferred. I don't meet the eligibility criteria as I earn over the income threshold, so neither of us qualify. If my husband, however, earned my income and our roles were reversed and I was on his income, staying at home, we would be eligible. We've asked to be considered under exceptional circumstances, but we're told that it was my choice to return to work and therefore not exceptional. My question to the panel is, do such policies represent an underlying gender bias which hinders the goal of bridging the gender pay gap and devalues women in the workplace and in society?
Alan Kohler.
Well, that's ridiculous, of course. I mean, and it clearly is a gender bias that goes back in history that we haven't yet thrown off. And I think that clearly the laws, the budgets, the laws, the bureaucracies need to even things up, of course. I mean, having read Jess Hill's book, I've just got myself halfway through The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, and learning about the history of these things makes me understand how embedded these attitudes are, how deeply, like thousands of years. And so it is taking a long time to change, but it is changing. I think, you know, the announcement that they're going to put more money into childcare is a good start, but it's such a small start.
Fiona Martin, it's almost unbelievable that this story is actually true. Were you aware of this?
Yes, in fact, I am aware of it. And one of the first letters I wrote to the Minister was about this very issue. So I agree with the lady that's asked the question, and I think that it should be changed, that we should have an even playing field between parents.
Which minister did you write to?
At the time, it was Minister Ruston.
OK, and what response did you get?
I didn't get the response that I wanted, so I'm hoping to still change it, and I'm confident that we should move in that direction, because it should be a choice that parents make, which parent goes back to work. It shouldn't be just based on the mother's financial circumstances. It should be a choice that the parents make.
Something I just want to say here is that we can make all kinds of incremental steps towards improving the situation, as Alan just said. But fundamentally, we will not fix inequality in the workplace until an employer is as afraid and resentful of a man becoming a father as they currently are afraid and resentful of women becoming mothers.
And so how do you do that?
It has to be use it or lose it. You have to give a certain amount, and it's for the parents, and it has to be just as appealing. It has to be just as potentially lucrative for a man to step away as it is for a woman, to the point where an employer is across the board equally terrified of anyone becoming a parent.
But part of the problem...
Does that make economic sense, Alan?
Well, part of the problem, Hamish, is I think the gender pay gap, so that when families make a decision who's going to stay at home, it usually is the right decision financially for the family, for the man to go back to work.
Right, that's also...
I'm not saying that's great. I mean, that's the problem, in a way. I mean, and so families make rational decisions on those bases because women get paid less.
But women get paid less because they're not promoted as much, because they face discrimination in the workplace.
Because they might get pregnant.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, that's right.
But with paid parental leave, it's not that scientific. I mean, there should be more of it and it should be more flexible. The position of the party that I represent is that our goal is to have 26 weeks of paid parental leave that can be used equally between the mother and the father. It should not be gendered in the way that it is at the moment.
Your goal, is that the same thing as a promise?
Goal.
What does that mean?
It means that we haven't come to a final position on it. It is
so
part
it's a bit wobbly, it's a bit rubbery.
No, that's not the case. It's part of the National Labor Party platform, and it is absolutely the view of the Labor Party that paid parental leave should apply equally to men and women, and there should be more of it.
I've got to push you on this. If it's not wobbly, why then isn't it a promise?
Well, it's not up to me to sit here and say this is a promise tonight. Obviously, there'll be discussions and a statement about this very clearly prior to the election, but I can say with absolute certainty to you and to the audience tonight and to the person who just asked the question is that there needs to be more weeks and they should be able to be used more flexibly. They don't have to be used all in one block. It could be the way in which couples want to take the leave, and there should be a greater flexibility in both access for men and women.
All right. Let's take our next question. It's a video and it comes from Kate Wood.
Many lower-income women have reduced or eliminated their superannuation balances through accessing the government's COVID early release scheme. Younger women, aged 24 to 34, who have done this, have done so at the very time when the super gender gap widens due to time spent out of the workforce caring for others. Will the government introduce concrete measures to help these women to recover their superannuation balances and to help all women to improve their retirement savings so that we're not facing another generation of women entering retirement with the prospect of poverty and homelessness?
Fiona Martin.
The situation was introduced in the 1990s and in 1991 actually by the Keating government. And what we know is, and as Lady mentioned, that obviously women who take the time out to have children and not working and not having an income during that period and not building their superannuation are at increased risk of issues with housing affordability later on in life. One of the most important things, I think, as a nation is housing and ensuring that Australians can afford housing. It's good for individuals and families and couples, but it's also good for the economy and it's good for national security, really, because people that invest in housing have building nationhood.
But Fiona Martin, the question was about whether the government might introduce concrete measures to help women recover their superannuation balances.
Well, the Australian government's Women's Economic Statement is focused on addressing these issues. And, one of the ways we do that is by providing affordable housing. So the Australian government has intervened because community housing organisations have had difficulties accessing loans from banks. So the Commonwealth Government has, in fact, provided low-cost loans to the community housing organisations to ensure that organisations like Baptist Care, for example, who have provided a community housing facility in my electorate of Reid in Five Dock, can create these projects which allow people who don't have access to housing later on in life can do so, and that includes women who don't have accumulated assets, so that they can have a stable, safe and secure place to live. And I've had the pleasure of visiting this particular facility, and I can tell tell you that it's a wonderful, wonderful project, and we should be doing more of them. We've in fact spent a significant amount of money in building these community housing projects around the country, and they are a way of addressing the affordable housing issue for women, particularly women who don't have assets later on in life.
Alan Kohler, and I should point out, you write for the New Daily, that's financially backed by industry super funds. So just to put that on the table before we get your response.
Well, I think I'd like to see women get more superannuation deductions, a higher superannuation guarantee levy than men, so that they can get to catch up. I mean, maybe you can stop doing that once women do catch up, but at the moment the superannuation guarantee levy is 9.5% for everybody. I think it should be more for women. I think I've heard of one or two companies that do that already to attract female employees, but I think it should be on a national level.
Do you think there should be a national commitment to paying more super to women?
Yes.
And how would that change the picture?
Well, over time, it would gradually allow women to catch up. And at that time, maybe you could go back to having the same amount. But at the moment, clearly, there is a huge gap. And I think it's a problem that the government needs to address. OK, maybe that's not the answer, but at least some sort of focus on thinking about what to do about it.
But what we do know now, Alan, and I'm not disagreeing with you, is that, and going specifically to what the questioner talked about, was the situation in our society for older women who didn't have PPL when they had children, who haven't had the sorts of superannuation or anything that existed now. Many women are in casual work. We know that women in particular are in low-paid work very often. And it seems to me that there needs to be more than a focus, with due respect, Fiona, on housing. It actually is about the gender pay gap, and it actually is about the fact that the cohort of people who have got the least security in this country are older women. And it is a particular policy question that has to be dealt with in that context.
Jess Hill, do you think that by forcing employers to pay women more super, make larger contributions, that might deter employers from employing women?
Yeah, that's a good point, Hamish. I guess to put some numbers around this, you know, the average man in Australia declares about $69,000 a year, and the average woman declares around $48,000. Just to give a sense of what is this gender pay gap. I think that this structural insecurity or the structural inequality that has been built into Australia's economic system between men and women makes women especially vulnerable at times such as these, like with COVID, where we've actually seen in the particular industries that have been hit hardest, being arts, recreation, hospitality. These are female-dominated industries, and unlike any other recession in our history, it's been women that have lost the majority of the jobs. And because they earn less than their male counterparts, they are, when it comes down to it, when a household has to choose who's going to forfeit their employment to look after the kids or whatever has to happen, then it just makes financial sense for the woman to choose to stay at home. And that's how these inequalities get set more and more in concrete. And I think one of the most stark and horrifying statistics is that since about February last year, 300,000 women not just left the workforce, they're no longer even looking for work. This is actually the impact of COVID actually has the potential to put back women's independence, financial independence, back decades in a way that we're not really dealing with, that the government hasn't addressed. You know, its first stimulus decision after when it was about the economic snapback was to give a stimulus boost to the construction industry, and the first people that lost out their JobKeeper were childcare workers. sometimes these responses are so naked and brazenly gendered that you just like it doesn't seem like conspiracy when you think like actually there is a gender inequality at the structural heart of the government.
And Jess, one of the really important things is to protect the age pension, because so many people, particularly older women, that's all they've got at the end of the day, even though for many of them they've worked their whole lives, they've been in professional positions. Hit 55, COVID comes along, you lose your job, you will never get back into employment.
Fiona Martin?
Can I just point out that women's participation in the workforce is the highest it's been, and
Since
that the gender pay gap is in fact the lowest it's been. Obviously, still across a number of industries, still problematic. But Australia is leading the way on this because of the way we report our workplace gender equality. There are 6 indicators that employers that have over 100 employees need to report on gender equality issues. And so because we've got compulsory reporting, we actually are leading the way, and we think that's a great way to kind of expose companies who aren't addressing these issues. But we certainly have the highest workforce participation rate for women, and we're certainly working our way to reduce the gender pay gap across industries. So we need to realise that we've come a long way, and during COVID, whilst it was incredibly difficult for women, that women actually, of the new jobs that were created during that period, women actually received 60% of those new jobs. So we do need to highlight that we actually have made a significant changes to women's workforce participation, and we have significantly been working hard to reduce the gender gap in Australia.
Fiona, it's a 2-speed economy, and I spent today in Melbourne, out around the outer parts of Melbourne. And I can tell you, I met with community organisations, and every single one of them spoke about the role and the position that women are finding themselves in, particularly women on visas, particularly women with English as a second language. And let me tell you, they are not doing well.
Related to this, which is a problem that has a specific solution, and so I can be quick, is that women's legal services in various states and territories have been saying for years that particularly for couples that are in low to low medium level income brackets, often when a couple splits, superannuation is their most valuable asset, and there are currently no proper and clear requirements for men to have to disclose the actual reality of their super balances.
Yeah.
And so when those low-income couples split, the women are even more disadvantaged.
Well, it often gets hidden.
Exactly. And we can solve that. Women's legal services have been complaining about that for years.
All right, let's take our next question. It comes from Leon Borak.
My question is for Alan. At the risk of being a privileged middle-aged white guy, asking another privileged middle-aged white guy to pontificate on social equity, I wanted to ask you about supercharged housing prices. For decades, the politics of fear has stalled a meaningful tax reform. Legislative and regulatory responses to the problem have been simplistic and sometimes exacerbated the problem. Does the impact of COVID-19 provide an opportunity for our politicians to rewrite the playbook? And if so, what initiatives should be at the top of their list?
Yeah, Alan, what?
Look, my kids are in the same position, trying to get a house, finding it's really difficult. Prices are so high. But the problem is that we call it an affordability crisis or an unaffordability crisis. And part of the problem is that houses have never been more affordable because of interest rates where they are. The mortgage rates are 2%. So everyone can afford a house now because of the repayments.
That's a pretty generous explanation for the situation.
The reason prices are going up is because everyone's bidding them up because they can afford to pay the repayments. That doesn't help with the deposit.
But if you're a young person and you're bidding on a 1 or 2 bedroom flat, the reality is you're bidding against superannuants who are buying an investment property.
Well, yeah. Well, the statistics have shown that first-home buyers have been the big drivers of the latest boom in house prices over the past 12 months. First-home buyers have really come into the market, and they are bidding. It's just in the past month.
Come on, you're not going to blame first-home buyers.
No, I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying that first-home buyers have been a big entrance into the market in the last 12 months. Investors less so. Last time, in the boom of 2015-16, it was all about investors. This time, it's been more about first-home buyers and other, owner-occupiers upgrading. Less so investors, although that's now changing a bit. The fundamental problem, which is to do with COVID, is that the cash rate is 0.1%. That's the problem. The Reserve Bank manipulating interest rates in order to achieve an economic outcome is distorting asset prices of all sorts, particularly property, but also shares. So all asset prices are being distorted. House prices are being driven up. The affordability, if you measure it in terms of repayment, is quite low. I mean, in the sense that houses are affordable. The problem is getting a deposit together. And then you get down to questions of intergenerational equity, and are the parents sitting on a whole lot of money in a house that's too big for them, and should they then start to share that money either through a reverse mortgage with the children so that they can... I mean, that's okay if you've got parents who own their house, of course, if your parents don't own their house. But I think that there is an issue about helping kids get deposits. I mean, because parents are living too too long now.
Some would say...
No, but by the time the parents die, the kids have retired.
But there are some arguing, actually, you should give them their super to help them buy a house.
Well, yeah, well, super won't do it, really. I mean, kids haven't got any money in super yet. I mean, it takes ages to build up enough in super to make a difference, to get a sort of house deposit. So that's really not going to cut it. I mean,
what about everyone has to rent though? They'll never ever be able to buy a home.
Yeah, well.
And the HECS repayment threshold in the year 2017 to 18 used to be 55 grand, and now it's 45.
I seem to be coming across as some kind of defender of this. But the thing is, one of the problems with being a tenant is that the laws in Australia favour landlords, and they're only just starting to change. In Europe, it's okay to be a tenant. People are tenants all their lives. It's fine because you get protected. In America, there's rent control. We have none of that in Australia. Tenants are really screwed here. And that's why everyone tries to buy a house. But if tenants were looked after better with the laws, and if there was some sort of rent control, then it wouldn't be such a big deal.
Long leases.
I mean, look, it is terrible if you end up retiring.
I'm going to give one very brief final thought to Fiona Martin, who I can see is trying to get in on the conversation. If you could keep it brief, because we're out of time.
Look, we definitely have the highest level of first home owners since 2009. So we are doing well with first homeowners, and that's because we've put in place some effective programs. The First Home Owners Deposit Scheme, for example, we're doing incredibly well there. We had up to, I think, 26,000 recipients of that program that we implemented. And also we put in place Home Builder, which we had 121,000 applications for. So these programs have proven effective, and they're programs that we've implemented.
Have they, Alan Kohler? Have they proved effective, or is it just the interest rates?
Of first home owner buyers.
Well, those first home owner grants have just gone on the price. The first home buyers have just, well, you know,
okay.
They just use the money and bid the price up, and the problem is that everything that you do for it just drives prices up higher, including interest rates lower.
Well, on that happy news, that's almost all we have time for tonight. Some music for you in a moment, but first, would you please thank our wonderful panel?
Thanks, everyone.
Linda Burney, Bree Lee, Alan Kohler, Fiona Martin, and Jess Hill. Thanks for joining us tonight, and to those of you streaming us on iView. Next week, we'll be live at the Canberra Theatre answering your questions on this year's federal budget. I'll be joined by an all-politician panel, including Jane Hume, Jim Chalmers, Larissa Waters and Jackie Lambie. We're leaving you tonight with a performance from Julia Stone. It's a song from her new album. Ladies and gentlemen, Julia Stone with 60 Summers.
Sing with a heart and heart for everything we've become. I never wanna hear you say you're sorry. Fall on the broken words. You wanna be the one to learn. Dreaming of the morning that I met you. Looking for the brightest star in the back of your car. We just wanna make each other happy. Then we made a little money just to do something fun. Only had the bags that we could carry. You said we only got 60 summers. How many more nights with lovers? I found my way home. Take me to the sea. Never wanna hear you say you lost me. And everything has to change. Lights inside this room. But it took so long to find you. And you say that you won't be afraid anymore. And we stay 'cause we want everything like before. Looking for the brightest star in the back of your car. We didn't even know that we were happy. Then we made a bit more money trying to be someone. We've got more bags than we can carry. You said we've only got 60 summers. How many more nights with lovers? 60 summers.